You guys getting sick of this thing yet? I hope not, because I'm really just starting to get into it now. And I'm going to tell you about a breakthrough. I think I found the missing link. Get to that in 1 second. But before I do, you know, I've been a little hard on my friends at DD Speed Shop. He's working through bugs. I get it. Dan, him, has decided to take a progressive approach to hot rodding, and I need to be supportive of his efforts, and I am. He's going to do great with that car. Everything's going to work out fine. It's going to prove that the new ways are the better ways. So, and I'm nobody to talk about having problems working through bugs. I mean, this thing over here, I visited all 7 depths of hell in the process of getting this from where we started to where it is now. It finally came around after how many false starts, right? And then Plan Z. So this is particularly frustrating. Has been frustrating because I'm dealing with stuff that I've never dealt with before. So I think I may have found one of the key missing links. And this is an example of not seeing the forest for the trees. I'll get to that in a minute. We have to first build up to it. So let's recap. The first time I took the car out, it felt staticky, like it wasn't pulling cleanly. It didn't sound clean. And I interpreted it as an ignition issue. So we came back and we went through the distributor, we went through a few different things. And sure enough, that was it. That cleared it up. Now the car doesn't feel staticky at all. It feels clean and smooth, but still not making any power. Now, by fixing the ignition issues, we picked up a full half-second ET, but nothing off the 60 foot. The 60 foot stayed the same, 206, 60 foot, really slow. And it doesn't really make the power that I expected to, that I wanted to, upstairs. But we've got 2 different issues. We've got 2 separate problems. We've got getting the car off the starting line and then getting the car to motor through with power. We're only going to concern ourselves with one area at a time. So we've got to get the car off the starting line first. That's the most important thing. So why isn't it getting off the starting line? This is multi-layered, right? So a lot of you guys said, oh, it's got way too much converter. It's got a 4,500 RPM converter. And a lot of you guys are like, oh, it's got way too much converter for that engine and blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't. 4,500 is about right for this engine. It's going to have a tight power band. It's going to start at around 4,000, 4,500, and it's going to finish at about 5,800, 6,000 RPM. A 4,500 RPM converter is just right. But I'm not using the converter the way it needs to be used. I'm power braking against the converter. I'm bringing it right up against its stall. Not its flash, but its stall. So I'm giving up probably 800 or 1,000 RPM on the initial hit because of that. Now, why am I doing that? Right? So this all fits together. So why am I doing that? Why am I power braking this thing? Because when I flat punch it, or even if I just get into the gas aggressively, it stumbles and it backfires. It'll just pop, 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 right? And I'm trying to avoid that. So why is it doing that? Now, I interpreted it as needing more fuel through the accelerator pump circuit, which would be the common thing with a V8. But on a Slant 6, we've got a unique situation with the intake manifold. So, on a Slant, you see the carburetor is set very far away from the engine itself. And the intake manifold on this engine overhangs nothing, right? Now, on the factory setup, the exhaust manifold clamps to the bottom of the intake right here. And that's what these 2 bolt holes are for, to clamp the exhaust manifold to the intake. Because this thing needs heat, and I'm not giving it any heat at all. So what's happening essentially is that I'm taking what would be an ice-cold engine without, let's say, a choke on, and flat punching it. It's going to stumble, backfire, stall. I misinterpreted it as needing more fuel, and so I got more aggressive with the pump shooters, with the pump cams, with the pumps themselves, trying to get this thing enough gas so that when I hit it, it wouldn't just fall on its face. But no matter how much fuel I put to this thing, it would still stumble when I would hit it. Well, the other day, we didn't film this. I was screwing around with the car out in the parking lot, and I let the thing get really hot. I let it get as hot as it was going to get, and my stumble went away. So it dawned on me at that point, it's the design of the intake manifold and how I'm treating this thing that's the problem. See, on a typical V8, the intake manifold is sandwiched between the two banks of the engine. And so there's always radiant heat coming up from the block and the heads, warming the intake. But on this thing, it overhangs nothing. And so when the engine sits for, let's say, 10 minutes or so, the engine itself, the block, the heads, everything is still warm, but the temperature of the intake manifold drops way down. And then I'm aggravating that situation by squirting a bunch of raw gas, which is going to have an even further cooling effect on the intake manifold, and aggravating that situation. Not enough heat to lighten up the fuel to let the engine actually inhale it and make power. It's just dribbling in. And the thing that got me started on this thought process was that the car has an unusual dynamic in that about 50 feet out or so, it'll start to pull really hard. So I'll power brake it. When I leave the starting line, I'm just taking my foot off the brake and going the rest of the way on the gas, and it just doesn't really react, it doesn't do anything, and then it gets out about 50 feet or so, and then all of a sudden it starts to pull really hard. And it dawned on me, that's when it's using up all of that extra fuel that I'm squirting in through the accelerator pump. Now, this isn't really going to show on a plug read because a plug read is showing you the rest of the run. So if I was to do, let's say, a plug read at 50 feet or 60 feet, I would get a different reading, different circumstance. So that's, I believe, the big problem with getting this thing off the starting line. If I can get it to leave without power braking the hell out of it and drowning it with gas, it'll flash the converter, hit, and actually accelerate. So I think that's where the problem is. So the plan of attack now is to start taking the fuel, all that extra fuel I added to it through the accelerator pump circuits. Trust me when I tell you, you could take this carburetor and stick it on a 600 cubic inch engine and flat punch it and it would just go. It's like there's that much fuel going through it. So the plan of attack now is to take all of that fuel away, go back to a normal cam, accelerator pump cams, smaller shooters, smaller pump, and then build the heat in the intake manifold. One of the big problems I had with this was that before we did the idle circuit modifications on this carburetor, it would idle very, very fat, and it would foul the plugs. Now, because of that, I would run the engine as sparingly as possible before we would make a run. So I'd start it up, I'd warm it up in the pits, and then I would roll up to the staging lanes and then start it sparingly, just you know, let it run for a couple of seconds just to move up or pull around, never really giving it enough time for that heat to radiate from the cylinder head all the way to the intake manifold and the plenum. So now what we're going to do is, I'm hesitant to add, I know a lot of you guys right away, you're going to say, well, add something, you know, heat sinked from the header to the bottom of the plenum. I'm hesitant to do that yet. I may do that at some point, but for right now I want to work with this setup exactly the way it is and just let this car sit and idle, because now that we've fixed the idle circuitry on it, we've scaled the idle circuitry to the engine, it'll sit there and idle for an hour and never dirty the plugs. So what I've got to do at this point is, when I'm sitting in the staging lanes, let the car run. Just let it sit, let it run, let all of that heat radiate up into the intake manifold. If I shut it off for more than 10 minutes or so, you shut it off, you let it sit for 10 minutes. The block is hot, the head is hot, the intake manifold is ice cold. So the strategy next time out is going to be to let this thing run and get as hot as it's going to get. Let it sit and idle in the staging lanes and get nice and hot, and then make our run. But first I'm going to take some of this fuel away. I'm going to take all the fuel away. I'm going to go back to stock size squirters and cams, and that should be that. Now that's not explaining all of the issues with this car, because we still have a lack of power overall, and I think that's in the exhaust, and we're going to get to that after we do this. First we have to get this car down. There's no reason why this car shouldn't produce 175 or so 60 foots, 170, 60 foots. So I'm fairly certain That's what it is that we're dealing with. It's a design that I've never had to deal with before. It's a circumstance I've never had to deal with before, but there it is. It's the basic inherent design of that Slant 6 intake manifold, sitting way off the engine, aluminum, so it's dissipating heat like crazy. That, I believe, is our main problem. So next time out, not this Saturday, but we're going to go out next Saturday with it. Hopefully that'll clear it up. Sometimes you don't see the forest for the trees. It should have been obvious to me, but it wasn't. Because you're looking at so many different aspects of a car. And it's like, it could be the simplest thing in the world, just like that. And then you start tricking yourself out of the park. Well, let me do this. And that's what I did with the carburetor. I kept adding fuel to it, adding fuel to it, adding fuel to it, when it didn't want any extra fuel. It wanted heat in the intake manifold to lighten up the fuel that was actually going in there. Working out the bugs. I'll see you tomorrow.